It was a cold, rainy evening in the city when Mark, a 16-year-old high school student, left the library after a long study session. He'd been preparing for exams for weeks and was eager to head home. His school was a few miles away, so he had to walk along the quiet streets, his shoes splashing in the puddles as he moved quickly. Mark wasn't too worried about the weather. It was just another typical night for him. He thought about the homework he still had to finish and his upcoming math test. But all of that changed in an instant. As Mark walked down the sidewalk, he heard a screech of tires. It was so loud, it made him freeze. He turned around just in time to see a sleek black car lose control, its headlights shining brightly as it skidded across the slick road. Mark's heart raced as he watched it slam into a tree on the side of the road with a deafening crash. Without thinking, Mark ran toward the wreck. The rain was pouring down harder now, and the sound of the rain hitting the ground mixed with the chaos from the crash. When he reached the car, the front end was smashed up, and the engine was still running. Smoke started rising from the hood. Mark knew he had to act fast. The driver wasn't moving inside. He tried the door, but it was stuck. He could hear the driver coughing, trying to breathe. Mark knew he had only a few seconds. He looked around desperately, then saw a small rock on the ground. Without thinking, he picked it up and used it to smash the passenger side window. Glass shattered, sending tiny pieces flying, but Mark barely noticed. He reached inside, trying to grab hold of the man sitting unconscious in the driver's seat. The man was heavy, and his body felt limp as Mark pulled him out through the broken window. The car's engine was sputtering, and there was no time to waste. Mark dragged him away from the car, just as he heard a loud pop. The tires were starting to catch fire. The rain made the ground slippery, but Mark kept pulling the man further away from the burning vehicle. His heart pounded in his chest, and his muscles ached, but he didn't stop. Finally, he managed to get the man to a safe distance, just as the car exploded in a burst of flames. Mark took a quick breath and checked the man for signs of life. He was breathing, but barely. His clothes were torn, and there were bruises on his face. Mark quickly pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "I need an ambulance," he said, his voice shaking. "There's been a car accident. The driver needs help." While he waited for the paramedics to arrive, Mark did his best to keep the man awake. He didn't know who he was yet, but that didn't matter. All Mark cared about was making sure he didn't die. He held the man's hand, trying to comfort him, even though he was scared too. The sirens of the ambulance grew louder, and soon paramedics were on the scene, taking over from Mark. They quickly assessed the situation and rushed the man to the hospital. Mark watched them go, still trying to catch his breath, his heart still racing. He didn't know who the man was, or if he would be okay, but he hoped he had done enough. Mark turned and began walking home, his mind racing. What had just happened? Had he really just saved someone's life? He tried to make sense of it all, but his thoughts were scattered. All he knew was that everything had changed in those few minutes, and he didn't understand yet what kind of difference it would make. "You said." The next few days passed in a blur for Mark. After the accident, he returned to his usual routine of school, work, and homework, trying to put the events behind him. But it wasn't easy. Every time he looked at his phone, he saw messages from friends asking about the crash, and his mind kept drifting back to that night. He couldn't shake the image of the man he'd pulled from the burning car. On the morning of the third day, Mark was sitting in his room when his mom called out to him from the living room. "Mark, come see this," she said. Her voice sounded excited, and Mark immediately sensed that something had changed. He walked into the living room and saw his mother sitting on the couch, holding the remote. She was watching the news. "Your face is on TV," she exclaimed. Mark froze, unsure of what she meant. He hadn't done anything special to deserve attention, but when he looked at the screen, there he was. His blurry face shone in the background of the news report. The image was a bit fuzzy, but it was clearly him, standing next to the wrecked car. helping the injured man. The news anchor was speaking. A young man saved the life of a local businessman, Gregory Hayes, after a car crash late Tuesday night. Mr. Hayes, a well-known figure in the city, was trapped in his luxury vehicle, which crashed after losing control on a wet road. Thanks to the quick actions of an unnamed hero, Mr. Hayes survived the ordeal. Mark felt his heart race as he heard the news. He had saved the man, but he had no idea who he was. Now he was learning that this wasn't just any ordinary person. Gregory Hayes was famous. He had a reputation as one of the richest and most influential businessmen in the city. Mark had never heard of him before the crash, but he suddenly realized that he had saved someone important. As the news continued, the anchor mentioned that Mr. Hayes was recovering in the hospital and wanted to personally thank the young man who had helped him. "We will bring you more details as soon as we have them," the anchor said, and the screen switched to a picture of Gregory Hayes in a hospital bed, smiling weakly. Mark turned to his mom, feeling overwhelmed. "I didn't know he was a millionaire," he said, still trying to process the information. His mother smiled and shook her head. "I don't think he knew who you were either. But you did something incredible, Mark." Later that afternoon, Mark was walking home from his part-time job at the grocery store when a black car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and a man in a suit stuck his head out. "Mark Bennett?" the man asked. Mark stopped, confused. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" "My name is Thomas," the man said. "I work for Mr. Gregory Hayes. He's asked me to find you. He wants to speak with you as soon as possible." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had seen the news report, but now, standing before him was someone who worked for the businessman. What did Gregory Hayes want with him? Mark hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Don't worry, young man," Thomas said, noticing Mark's hesitation. "Mr. Hayes just wants to thank you personally for saving his life. He feels deeply grateful and would like to show his appreciation." Mark's mind was racing. He hadn't expected anything like this. "Okay," he said finally, "I'll meet him." As Mark walked away from the car, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of life Gregory Hayes led. He'd never imagined that a simple act of kindness would lead to anything like this. Little did Mark know, meeting the millionaire was just the beginning of a much bigger story. Mark had always lived a simple life. His family was modest, his house small, and his neighborhood was quiet. He didn't ask for much, just good grades, a few close friends, and the chance to make something of himself. His parents worked hard every day to make sure he had everything he needed. They didn't have a lot of money, but they had love and support. Mark had grown used to not having fancy things, and that didn't bother him. At school, Mark was known for his quiet nature. He wasn't the most popular kid, but he was friendly and well-liked. He kept his head down and focused on his studies. Most days after school, he went straight to his part-time job at a local grocery store. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped with expenses, and it gave him some extra spending money. Mark's goal was to save enough to get a scholarship to college. He had dreams of studying engineering or computer science, but for now, his life was all about small, everyday things. His friends often joked that Mark lived a boring life. They went out to the movies, played video games, and spent weekends hanging out, but Mark usually chose to stay home and catch up on homework or read a book. He liked being alone, and he didn't mind the calm routine of his life. It was all he knew. His family was everything to him. His mom worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and his dad was a mechanic at a car shop. They both worked long hours to provide for him and his younger sister, Emma. Mark appreciated everything they did, but he never really complained about his life. He was content, and that was enough for him. So when the news story about the car accident aired and his face appeared on TV, Mark was completely caught off guard. He wasn't used to the spotlight, and he definitely wasn't someone who looked for attention. His friends were all messaging him, congratulating him for being a hero, but Mark didn't feel like a hero. He just did what he thought was right in that moment. He didn't want praise or rewards. He just wanted to go back to his normal life. The attention that came after the accident felt strange. People started recognizing him on the street, asking if he was the one who had saved the millionaire, Gregory Hayes. Mark had never met Gregory Hayes before that night, and the whole thing felt surreal. But what bothered him the most was how everything had suddenly changed. His quiet life, the one he had always known, was now full of questions and attention he didn't know how to handle. His parents, on the other hand, were thrilled. They were proud of Mark, of course, but they didn't quite know how to handle the sudden recognition either. His mom kept telling him how proud she was and how grateful she was that he'd helped someone in need. His dad, though more reserved, gave him a smile and a nod whenever the topic came up. Despite the praise, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his life was slipping away from him. He hadn't expected anything like this. He never thought saving someone's life could bring so much attention. And now, with Gregory Hayes wanting to meet him, Mark couldn't help but wonder what kind of world he was stepping into. Would it change everything? Or would it just add more noise to the life he had always known? Mark tried to focus on school, but it wasn't easy. His mind kept drifting back to the night of the accident, and he kept wondering if he had done the right thing. Would his life really be different now? And what did Gregory Hayes want from him? Mark didn't know the answers yet, but he was about to find out. The phone call came early the next morning. Mark had just finished a quick breakfast when his mom walked into his room holding her phone with a wide grin on her face. "Mark, you need to see this," she said, excitement in her voice. Mark groggily stood up from his desk, rubbing his eyes. He had barely slept the night before, his mind still buzzing from the news reports about the crash and the mysterious millionaire he had helped. He had tried to ignore the attention, but it seemed impossible. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "Just look." She handed him the phone, and Mark took it reluctantly. The screen showed a news article, the headline boldly stating, "Young hero saves millionaire businessman in car crash." His face was front and center, his blurred image captured on a still shot from the news footage. Below the headline was a picture of Gregory Hayes in his hospital bed, looking a little bruised but smiling. Mark's stomach dropped. "This is crazy," he whispered to himself. The article didn't just mention the accident. It praised the actions of the mysterious young man who had saved Gregory Hayes. The story described how Mark had acted quickly and bravely, pulling the injured man from the wrecked car just before it exploded in flames. It was strange to see his name in print, especially in connection with something so dramatic. Mark had always preferred to keep a low profile, and now he was suddenly the talk of the town. His mom, still grinning, sat down beside him. "Look at this, Mark. You're a hero. This is big." Mark swallowed nervously. The attention felt overwhelming. He had never liked being in the spotlight, and now it seemed like everyone knew who he was. At school, friends and strangers alike approached him with congratulations, some even asking for selfies. Mark was polite but uncomfortable. The more people celebrated him, the more he just wanted to be left alone. But the media wasn't done yet. A few days after the news article, a local TV station ran a story about Mark's heroic actions. They showed clips from the crash site, with Mark's blurred face helping Gregory Hayes. The report also revealed that Gregory Hayes, now recovering in the hospital, wanted to meet with the young man who had saved his life. Mark's phone rang again, this time from a private number. It was Thomas, the man who worked for Gregory Hayes. "Hello, Mark," he said in a calm, businesslike tone. "Mr. Hayes would like to personally thank you for saving his life. He is very grateful and would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience." Mark was taken aback. He had never expected anything like this. I'm not sure. I mean, I didn't do it for recognition," Mark said, his voice nervous. Thomas chuckled lightly. "Of course, Mark. Mr. Hayes understands. He just wants to meet you in person to show his appreciation." The offer seemed harmless enough, but it was the first time in Mark's life that something like this had happened. Meeting with a millionaire. Someone so far removed from his everyday life. Felt surreal. Still, Mark knew he couldn't turn down the opportunity. "Okay," he finally said. "I'll meet him." After hanging up, Mark sat quietly, trying to process everything. He had saved someone's life, but now he was going to meet a man who had wealth, power, and a life completely different from his own. Mark didn't know what would happen next, but he couldn't help feeling that this meeting was about to change everything. "You said." The meeting with Gregory Hayes was scheduled for the following week. Mark wasn't sure what to expect, but he felt a mix of curiosity and nervousness. He had never imagined his life could be so complicated by a single act of kindness. He wasn't used to attention, and he definitely wasn't used to being invited into the world of millionaires. Gregory Hayes was a businessman, someone whose name was often in the news, and Mark knew that meeting him would probably change things forever. The day of the meeting, Mark dressed in his best clothes, a simple shirt and pants, the nicest things he owned. His parents had encouraged him to dress up for the occasion, but Mark still felt out of place. He didn't want to look like he was trying too hard. As he stepped outside, his mother gave him a hug. "Good luck, Mark," she said with a proud smile. When Mark arrived at Gregory Hayes' office, he was struck by the sheer size of the building. The towering glass structure seemed to reach the sky, and the sleek cars parked outside only reminded him of how different his life was from this world. He stood for a moment, trying to calm his nerves before entering. Inside, the lobby was just as impressive: high ceilings, polished marble floors, and elegant furniture. A receptionist smiled at Mark as he entered and asked for his name. "You're expected," she said, and before long, she directed him to an elevator that took him up to the top floor. Mark had never been in such a fancy place before. He tried to act calm, but he couldn't help but feel small compared to the luxury around him. The elevator doors opened to a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave a stunning view of the city. Gregory Hayes was standing near his desk, dressed in a dark suit, looking every bit the successful businessman he had seen on TV. "Mark." Gregory greeted him warmly, extending his hand. "It's so good to finally meet you." Mark shook his hand, trying to keep his cool. "Thank you for meeting with me," Mark said quietly. "I didn't expect all of this." Gregory smiled. "You've earned it, my friend. You saved my life, and I'll never forget that." He motioned for Mark to sit down, and the two of them took a seat by the window. They spent some time talking about the accident and how Gregory had been recovering. Gregory seemed genuinely grateful, but Mark could tell he was trying to keep things light, as though he didn't want to make Mark uncomfortable. After a few moments, Gregory's tone shifted. "I want to thank you in a way that feels right," Gregory said, his voice steady. "You saved my life, and I don't take that lightly. I'm offering you a reward. A very generous reward." Mark's eyes widened. He hadn't been expecting anything like this. "I didn't do it for a reward," Mark replied, unsure how to respond. "I know you didn't," Gregory said, nodding. "But you deserve something. A gift, if you will. You've done something most people would never have the courage to do, and I want to make sure you're taken care of. I'd like to offer you $50,000. Mark blinked. The number was staggering. $50,000 was far more money than he had ever imagined seeing in his life. It would be enough to change everything: pay for college, help his family, maybe even change the course of his future. But Mark wasn't sure what to say. It felt wrong to accept something so big for just doing the right thing. He looked down at his hands, unsure how to respond. Gregory could see Mark's hesitation. "I understand if it's too much. But think about it, Mark. You've given me a second chance at life. The least I can do is give you the opportunity to follow your dreams." Mark sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the offer hanging in the air. He had never been one to seek rewards, but the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. Could he accept this gift, or would it change him in ways he didn't want? In the end, Mark knew there was no easy answer, But Gregory Hayes wasn't going to take no for an answer. He was determined to show his gratitude. It seemed like Mark's quiet life was about to take a dramatic turn. Mark's life seemed to be moving faster than he could keep up. After meeting Gregory Hayes, he couldn't stop thinking about the generous reward he'd been offered. It felt strange to even consider accepting such a large sum of money. He had never dreamed of having that kind of wealth, and the more he thought about it, the more it made him uncomfortable. His parents had always taught him to work for what he earned, not to take handouts. But Gregory had insisted, and the offer had been so generous. Mark didn't know what to do. A few days after the meeting, life seemed to return to normal, or so he thought. Mark was at home, reading through some homework assignments and listening to music when the doorbell rang. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and he wasn't expecting anyone. His mother answered the door, and Mark heard a voice he didn't recognize. "Is Mark been at home?" the voice asked. Curious, Mark got up and walked into the hallway. When he saw two police officers standing at the door, his heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. Why were the police here? He hadn't done anything wrong. Mark's mom looked at the officers, then back at Mark, who stood frozen in place. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "We need to speak with Mark," one of the officers said, looking serious but not unfriendly. "Is he here?" Mark nodded, his stomach in knots. "I'm Mark," he said quietly, stepping forward. The officers asked if they could come in. His mother stepped aside, and the two men walked inside, their heavy boots making a soft sound on the wooden floor. Mark's mom motioned for him to sit down, and he did, feeling nervous about what was going on. The officers introduced themselves. "I'm Officer Thompson, and this is Officer Hayes. We're here regarding the car accident last week. We need to ask you a few questions, Mark." Mark's mind raced again. The accident. What could the police want with him? He had already given his statement to the paramedics and the hospital. Everything had seemed so simple. But now, the officers were here in his home, and things didn't seem as clear as they had before. Officer Thompson looked at him kindly but firmly. "We need to understand exactly what happened the night of the crash. Did you know the driver of the car? How did you happen to be in the right place at the right time?" Mark swallowed nervously. "No, I didn't know him," he replied. "I was just walking home when I heard the crash. I didn't even think about it. I just ran to help." The officers exchanged a glance but didn't say anything at first. Officer Hayes spoke up. "We understand, Mark. It's just that Mr. Hayes, he's a very important person. We're following up on everything, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding." Mark didn't understand. What misunderstanding? He hadn't done anything wrong. He had saved a life. Why were they making it sound like something else was going on? "I don't know what you're talking about," Mark said, feeling frustrated. "I did what anyone would have done. I helped him." The officers nodded, but their serious expressions didn't change. "We understand," Officer Thompson said. "We're just doing our job, Mark. Don't worry. We'll let you know if we need anything else." With that, the officers stood up, and Mark's mom walked them to the door. Mark was left sitting on the couch, confused and uneasy. The visit had been so strange, and he still didn't understand why the police had come to his house. When his mom returned to the living room, she looked at him with concern. "What do you think that was all about, Mark?" she asked, still puzzled by the visit. "I don't know, Mom, but it feels like something isn't right. Why would they need to question me again?" Mark had no answers, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about saving someone's life anymore. There was something bigger happening, and he wasn't sure what it was. The next few days passed in a haze for Mark. He couldn't stop thinking about the visit from the police officers. Their questions didn't sit right with him. Why had they asked so many details about the accident? Why were they making it sound like there was more to the story than just him helping someone in need? Mark tried to push it all out of his mind. School had been busy, and his part-time job at the grocery store kept him occupied. But every time he saw a police car drive by or heard a siren in the distance, his heart skipped a beat. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever that might be. A few days after the police visit, the phone rang again. This time, it was a familiar voice, Thomas, the man from Gregory Hayes' office. "Mark," Thomas said calmly, "Mr. Hayes would like to speak with you again. There are some things he needs to clear up, and he'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience." Mark's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure he wanted to meet with Gregory again. The last time they spoke, it felt strange. Gregory had been kind, but Mark still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The offer of money had caught him off guard, and the visit from the police only added to his unease. "Okay," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll come." When Mark arrived at Gregory Hayes' office, the atmosphere was different than before. He was ushered into a private conference room, where Gregory was waiting for him. The room was large and elegant, with dark wood furniture and tall windows that looked out over the city. Gregory stood when Mark entered, greeting him with a warm smile, but there was something in his eyes, a hint of worry that Mark hadn't noticed before. "Mark, I appreciate you coming," Gregory said, gesturing for him to sit. Mark sat down, feeling the weight of the moment. "What's going on, Mr. Hayes? Why did the police come to my house?" Gregory sighed and ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said, his voice low. "But there are things about that night, things that aren't as simple as they seem." Mark's heart raced. "What do you mean? I just helped you. I didn't know who you were. I wasn't trying to get involved in anything." Gregory looked at him for a long moment, as though deciding how much to reveal. "It's not about you, Mark. It's about me. I've made some mistakes, things I've done that I didn't want anyone to know about." Mark's confusion deepened. "Mistakes? What kind of mistakes?" Gregory hesitated, then looked away. "I've been involved in some business dealings that aren't exactly legal. The crash, it wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to make sure I didn't make it out alive." Mark's eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're saying someone tried to kill you?" Gregory nodded slowly. "Yes, and that's why the police are involved. They're trying to figure out who's behind it. But Mark, I want you to know, you're not in trouble. I never wanted you to be part of this. I just didn't know how to get away from it." Mark sat there, trying to process everything Gregory had just said. It felt like his world had shifted again, and he didn't know how to deal with it. He had saved someone's life, but now that simple act of kindness was entangled in a dangerous web he didn't understand. "I don't want any part in this," Mark said quietly, his voice shaky. "I just did what anyone would do. I'm not involved in whatever's going on with you." Gregory nodded, looking guilty. "I know, Mark. I didn't want to drag you into this. But I have to be honest with you. The police might keep asking you questions, and I can't stop that. Just remember, don't tell them anything more than you already have. You're not in danger, but they might want to know everything about the crash." Mark was silent, still processing the shocking truth. What had he gotten himself into? The simple act of helping someone had led him into a world of secrets and lies. He didn't know who to trust anymore, and all he wanted was to go back to his quiet life. But now, it seemed like that wasn't an option. Mark sat silently in the conference room, trying to process everything Gregory had just told him. His mind was spinning. A simple act of kindness had suddenly thrown him into the middle of a complex situation. Gregory Hayes, the millionaire he had saved, was not just a businessman. He was tangled in something dangerous, something Mark didn't want to be a part of. But it seemed like he couldn't escape. Gregory, sensing Mark's confusion and discomfort, leaned forward and spoke gently. "Mark, I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to understand the full picture. The crash, it wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately tried to hurt me. I've been involved in some business dealings that have attracted the wrong kind of attention, and because of that, I've been targeted. Mark looked at Gregory, his face filled with disbelief. But you said you didn't want me to be part of this. Why are you telling me all of this now? Gregory sighed and looked out the window for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Because, Mark, the police are going to keep asking questions, and I didn't want you to be blindsided. I should have been more upfront with you. The last thing I'd want is for you to get caught up in something you didn't sign up for. Mark's heart raced as the gravity of the situation sank in. So the police, they think I'm involved in whatever's going on with you. Gregory shook his head. No, not at all. You're not involved. But they're going to want to know more about the crash. They'll ask you everything about that night, trying to figure out if there's any connection between me and whoever tried to harm me. I can't control that, but I want you to be prepared. Mark felt a wave of frustration and confusion. He had helped a man in need, and now it felt like everything had gotten so complicated. I don't want anything to do with this, Gregory. I just did what anyone would have done. I know, Mark, Gregory replied softly. But sometimes life throws us into situations we didn't ask for. You saved my life, and I owe you. I just want to make sure you don't end up in a mess that's not yours. Mark nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. It wasn't fair. He had only wanted to help, but now he was being dragged into something he didn't understand. He didn't want to be caught in a world of corruption, danger, and secrets. All he wanted was his quiet life back. Gregory paused for a moment, then added, I'll make sure you're protected. I know this isn't what you signed up for, but I'm not going to let you be hurt because of something I was involved in. If you ever feel like things are getting out of hand, let me know. I'll do whatever I can to help. Mark wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or even more uneasy. He appreciated Gregory's offer, but he didn't want anyone's help. He just wanted to stay out of it. As he stood up to leave, Mark looked at Gregory one last time. I didn't ask for any of this, Mark said quietly, his voice full of frustration. I don't know why this is happening, but I want to be left alone. Gregory nodded, his expression serious. I understand, Mark. But remember, sometimes things happen that we can't control. All I can do is make sure you're safe. Mark left the office, his thoughts swirling. He hadn't expected his life to change so quickly. What had started as a simple act of heroism had become something much more complicated. Now he was stuck between trying to stay out of trouble and dealing with a man who seemed to have a complicated past. Mark didn't know how things would turn out, but he knew one thing for sure. His quiet life would never be the same again. After his meeting with Gregory Hayes, Mark couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. He had thought helping someone would be simple, that it would be just another story to tell his friends. But now, everything had changed. The crash, the reward, the visit from the police. It all felt like a whirlwind that had picked him up and tossed him into a world he didn't understand. For the next few days, Mark tried to go about his life like nothing had happened. He kept up with his schoolwork, helped his parents around the house, and went to his part-time job at the grocery store. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop thinking about everything that had unfolded. Gregory's warning about the police, the secret business dealings, and the question that kept repeating in his mind. Why had someone tried to harm Gregory Hayes? It was hard for Mark to ignore the tension that lingered in the air. The police were still asking questions, and Mark's friends started talking about the crash more and more. Some even joked that he was famous now, but to Mark, it wasn't something to joke about. He had been thrust into something far bigger than he was prepared for. He didn't want to be a part of Gregory's world anymore, but no matter how hard he tried to push it away, the situation seemed to follow him. One afternoon after school, Mark was walking home when his phone rang. It was Thomas again, the man from Gregory's office. Mark hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what to expect. Mark, it's Thomas. "I just wanted to let you know that everything with the police has been cleared up," Thomas said in his usual calm voice. "There's no need to worry. The investigation into the crash is still ongoing, but you're not in trouble. Everything's going to be fine." Mark sighed with relief. The police had been a constant worry since that first visit, and hearing that things were finally settled made him feel like a weight had been lifted. But the uneasy feeling still lingered. No matter what Thomas said, Mark knew his life had already changed in ways he couldn't control. "Thanks for letting me know," Mark replied, his voice quieter than usual. "But I still don't understand all of this. Why did it happen to me?" Thomas paused before responding. "Sometimes life throws us into situations we don't expect, Mark. You did something good, and because of that, things got complicated. But in the end, you did the right thing, and that's what matters." Mark didn't respond right away. He didn't know if he agreed. Doing the right thing had brought him attention, police visits, and complicated questions. It felt like a lot more than he bargained for. Later that evening, after dinner, Mark sat down with his parents. They had been supportive throughout everything, but he could tell they were still worried. They had seen the news stories, heard the rumors, and they knew something had changed. "Mark," his dad said, looking at him with concern, "how are you feeling about everything?" Mark shrugged. "It's been weird, Dad. I don't know what's going on, but I just want things to go back to normal. I didn't ask for all of this." His mom nodded. "We understand. But just remember, you did something brave. Helping someone when they need it is always the right thing to do. Whatever happens, we're proud of you." Mark smiled weakly, appreciating their support. But deep down, he knew things couldn't just go back to how they were. He had seen a side of life he never knew existed, and it had left him questioning everything. But one thing was clear: he would carry the lessons from this experience with him, even if he couldn't fully understand them yet. In the weeks that followed, the media's interest in Mark faded. The investigation into Gregory's crash continued, but Mark was left to move on with his life. He returned to his usual routine, focusing on his schoolwork and spending time with his family. He still didn't know what the future held, but he had learned something important. Sometimes, doing the right thing means facing unexpected challenges. And even when things get complicated, staying true to yourself is the only way forward. Mark had helped a stranger, and in doing so, had stepped into a world of uncertainty. But now he was ready to take control of his own life again. And no matter where the future took him, he would always remember the lessons he had learned along the way.